Hey, this is Brandon. Today is an incredibly exciting day for me. My brand new book, Beauty in the Wreckage, Finding Peace in the Age of Outrage, is for sale everywhere online where fine books are sold. And rather than give you a couple of sentences describing it, this entire episode is the introduction to the book, and it describes the heart of the book and why I had to write it. I hope that you not only enjoy this episode, I hope that you'll pick up my book and tell others about it. And now, episode 43, Beauty in the Wreckage.
Hello, is this Outside the Walls?
You are listening to the Outside the Walls podcast, thoughts and perspectives that go beyond the walls of the church, with writer and speaker Brandon Andress.
As I took Aberdeen outside for the last time on that frigid Wednesday night in late January, I stood on the cold, dark patio and sobbed as I watched him feebly sniff the ground around him. In that moment, he was a frail, sad shadow of his former self, but also the embodiment of 18 and a half years of profound joy, undying loyalty, and unending friendship. And while I knew I would be sad, I didn't expect to be so heartbroken. We were newlyweds when we bought our miniature schnauzer for $350 in 1998. As naive early 20-somethings who didn't make much money, we overdrafted our checking account that month. But in our minds, Aberdeen was going to be our trial run at having a baby. We learned the responsibility of cleaning up his messes, fixing everything he tore up, and taking him out in the middle of the night to do his business. Aberdeen was certainly one of our children. And even leading up to his final day, we still referred to him as our firstborn. There's no question that he was the greatest overdraft we ever made. It's hard to explain the distance between your head and your heart. Your head can be so logical, so rational, so calculated, and sometimes so detached from your heart and emotions. While Aberdeen had slowly been deteriorating over the last couple of years, we knew the time would soon be approaching when we would have to make the difficult decision. We thought that even though we would be sad from his passing, it would be made easier by the fact that he was old, losing weight, and suffering from a neurological disorder that made walking and standing difficult and sometimes impossible. Our heads told us that this was the right decision, but nothing told our hearts to be prepared for being so wrecked. As we stood with Aberdeen in those final moments in the tiny, square examination room lit by the harsh fluorescent lights above, a flood of grief washed over us. All I could think of were the words of our oldest daughter, Anna, when she said the night before, "Do you know why Aberdeen has lived so long? Because he's happy." The joy of knowing our precious dog loved us, always wanted to be with us, and was still pressing on to live another day while his little body wasted away, was met with the violent and horrific tension of our inner grief as we watched him take his final breath. And all I could say with tears running down my face was, "I'm sorry, Aberdeen, I'm so sorry." If you've ever had a pet become a part of your family, you know how incredibly difficult that moment is. But by comparison, his passing seems so insignificant in relation to what we had just walked through before, and then immediately after his death. A few months prior, we experienced the unforeseen loss of our close friend's newborn son, Oliver. He was a healthy, full-term baby who inexplicably died just before the delivery. Neither Kim nor Wilfred, Oliver's mom and dad, nor anyone else could have imagined such a horrifically painful ending to such a perfect pregnancy. And when I received Kim's dreadful text early the next morning, while I was getting ready for work, my heart felt like a cold, dark, infinite void. He was a beautiful baby boy whom neither Kim nor Wilfred would ever have the chance to hold, to kiss on his cheeks, or to blow raspberries on his belly. He should have never died so early. While carrying the weight and burden of Oliver and Aberdeen's losses, tragedy struck again as we suffered yet another loss in late February, and it was beyond anything we had ever previously experienced. Our best friends Adam and Jackie, with whom we had been in house church for the last 12 years, lost their 15-year-old son Abbott in an unexpectedly tragic accident. Abbott's death completely and utterly devastated us. I remember being in the hospital waiting room that night when the trauma team came in and told us that they could not save him. It didn't seem real. It actually seemed incomprehensible. I sat on the uncomfortable arm of a cheaply made mauve hospital chair and stared lifelessly out the window and thought, how do we even do this? We were entering uncharted territory where none of us had ever previously traveled. And a year later, here we are, still traveling through this uncharted territory together in patient, abiding love. But it's been the hardest road that we've ever traveled with each other. The pain and tragedy of death seemed to have us in its grips in that fateful season. And there was even more heartache that had been encircling us through it all. Jeremy, another great friend who has been in our house church for the last 12 years with his wife Jess and their 2 elementary-age boys, was arrested in his position as the chief of narcotics with the Columbus Police Department. Jeremy got addicted to legally prescribed painkillers, which then led to him increasingly feeding his addiction by stealing confiscated illegal narcotics from the evidence room to which he had access in his position. Jeremy was convicted and sentenced to time in jail. And I honestly wondered how, or even if, we could ever make it through the crushing burden of all of these catastrophes that were resolved to bury us. While Jeremy was in jail, and as we cared for Jess and the boys, we walked with Adam and Jackie through the immense pain, suffering, anger, and doubt that we all carried with us. And that is what the spring and summer of 2017 looked like. It was difficult. It was a journey through the valley of the shadow of death, and we carried the accumulating heartache of loss and sadness with us every step of the way. And then August came like Erebus, looking for a knockout punch. What started as a much-needed respite, backpacking with Adam and a couple other friends for a week in the heart of the Alaskan backcountry, turned into yet another crushing blow when I returned home and found out that my 43-year-old work partner Jenny, with whom I had worked side by side for the last 8 years, was told that she had cancer in her lung and liver. The diagnosis came out of nowhere, as she had been in remission from breast cancer for almost 5 years. But within 8 weeks of her initial diagnosis, the cancer moved to her brain, and she died just before Thanksgiving. I know it sounds like a lot. It has been. It has been a lot. I have shed more tears this past year than I had collectively in my first 43 years of life. Without question, it was the hardest year of my life. But I don't want to pretend as if what I've experienced is the greatest pain and suffering in human history. It isn't. I acknowledge that. There are so many people, maybe even you, who have suffered or who are currently suffering in ways unimaginably more than me. The point is not in trying to determine who has experienced greater pain and suffering in their life. That's a futile endeavor and it completely misses the point. Rather, it's to add my story among stories as a humble contribution to our shared human experience of navigating life's painful valleys. Each one of us know what it's like to hurt, to be wounded, to be burdened, to groan, to cry. And whether it's the pain of losing a loved one, the agony of feeling trapped and helpless in your life situation, the battle of stage 4 breast cancer, or the suffocation and anxiety caused by the hostilities and divisions of our country, by our rat race culture, or by the constant stress of trying to make ends meet, or to raise kids, we are all in this human experience together. But it is difficult to not lose heart when everything feels so overwhelming. Our lives can feel so far from what our hearts desire, so far from what our souls crave. And then, as if it's not enough, right in the middle of all this pain and chaos and division and stress that surrounds us, we're confronted with the seemingly impossible words of Jesus reminding us that he came to give us life to the fullest. Believe me, I can hear your chorus of groans and your heavy sighs. If you're anything like me, you wonder how in the world can you experience anything close to life to the fullest when your tank is running on half empty at best, or running on fumes at worst. How in the world can you experience anything remotely close to life in abundance when there's just so much pain, so much suffering, and so much anxiety and stress through it all? But the words of Jesus kept haunting me and confronting me in a tireless, unending refrain. I have come that you might have life and have it abundantly. Okay, sure. We'd long and hunger and desire for a life of abundance, but it seems like a monumental impossibility. It seems like the naive sentiment of a simple man living 2 millennia ago who is woefully detached from our postmodern sensibilities. Even still, I long for that kind of life. My deepest longing is to be enveloped in the perfect love of God. My greatest hunger is to experience and live in the completeness, wholeness, and harmony of the divine, not just in my own life, but in all of my relationships and with all of creation. My steadfast desire is to not dismiss or minimize pain and suffering and anxiety in the world, but to be an ever-present and humble student who learns how to see beauty and who then learns how to share it through my words and how I live my life, even when the wreckage continues to accumulate around me. If there is another reality that surrounds us, that holds us, that invites us into unending life and beauty, that transcends every division and animosity and hostility, that opens us up to new ways of living, how do we even begin to find it? And then how do we begin to live in it and invite others into it? The surprising discovery is that even in the heartache, even in the hostility, even in the division, and even in the midst of violence and oppression, experiencing life to the fullest, a life of shalom, is not just possible, it can be our present reality. But in order to discover it, we must learn how to see and live differently, moment by moment, for the transformation of our lives, our families, our relationships, and our communities. That's the intention of this book. But first, let me tell you what this book is not. It's not a self-help book. It's not a 5-point sermon with fill in the blanks. It's not a book that's going to tell you what you need to do to fix yourself and then a step-by-step guide to fix the world around you. This is a book that will guide you, that will lead you, but will never force you or coerce you into anything. This book may ask more questions than what it answers. It may even cause you to ask more questions than you have answers for yourself. But at the very heart of this book is one underlying question that lingers behind every chapter. Is it possible to experience life to the fullest, a life of shalom, in the midst of so much pain and suffering, in the middle of so much hostility and division, and in the middle of so much stress and anxiety? And then surrounding that central question are so many more questions. Is it possible to move beyond labels, hierarchies, stereotypes, antagonisms, and divisions, and begin to see people differently and make strides toward a greater unity between us? Is it possible in the wreckage around us to find this life to the fullest, this life of shalom, when so much of organized religion seems to have guided us poorly, led us astray, and become so irrelevant to our culture? Is it possible to ever experience life to the fullest once you've been through painful and traumatic life situations or suffering? Or are we destined for lives in which our pain and suffering are an end destination? How can prayer center us and help us enter into a constant union and communion with the divine that begins to birth the shalom of God within us? How can the experience of shalom lead to a deeper life of transformation and invite us to become who we were always meant to be? How can living in shalom open our eyes and awaken our hearts to the glory and beauty that surrounds us each day? How does a deeply rooted and intimately connected community or family nourish and strengthen us to experience greater depths of shalom? How does the experience of shalom not only transform us individually and relationally, but also begin to transform our communities and our world? I know this may seem like an impossible task, and by the way things appear in the world right now, you may believe this is actually an impossible endeavor. But it's my hope that through the words on these pages, that we'll find space to humbly walk together, to find our collective breath, and to save our souls. A few years ago, my then 4-year-old son and I went on our very first overnight backpacking adventure. I can't underscore how important this first trip was for us. I've been all throughout the United States in some of the most beautiful places on Earth, completely cut off from civilization and communication, fighting with grizzlies and running with elk and caribou. Well, I haven't fought grizzlies, nor have I run with elk and caribou, but I have been dangerously close to them, seriously. Anyway, this first overnight backpacking trip with Will was very important to me because I didn't want it to be a bad experience for him on his first time out. Of course, we had previously set up our tent and camped in our backyard several times, and he really enjoyed that, but leaving the familiarity of our house and going into areas in which we were unfamiliar was a complete wild card. We drove an hour away from our house and ended up in the Hoosier National Forestry in south central Indiana. This area is beautifully wooded and hilly and perfect for a first-timer. I could tell Will was excited based on how much he talked during the hour that it took us to drive there. He peppered me with 1 million 4-year-old questions that ranged from what we were going to eat to how we were going to brush our teeth. He was so pumped up. When we pulled into the parking area, he was already out of his car seat and standing by the car in wild excitement. He put on his jacket and asked me to help him with his backpack. I helped him, and then I put on my own backpack, and we were off. It was a cool spring evening, not quite sunset, and everything was exploding to life around us. It was absolutely perfect. Will knew it as well. Every 30 seconds for the next hour, and this is no exaggeration, Will kept yelling, "For heaven's sakes, this is so awesome! For heaven's sakes, this is so awesome!" That may have been one of the greatest moments of my life. Sure, I was glad that Will was off to a great start, but it was so much more than that. In Will, I saw who I longed to be as an adult. Even though we walked through thick mud and miles of thorn bushes that lined the trails, he just kept shouting how awesome his experience was. Will was unknowingly showing me how far I have traveled from the mystery and wonder of this life. And while I was preoccupied with mud and thorn bushes, Will was preoccupied with wonder and the joyful exuberance of a child. I am so there with you, brother. Thank you for teaching me to see differently when all I could see in the moment was the mud caked on my boots and the blood running from my arm. You were exactly right. This is so awesome. This is so awesome. For heaven's sakes, this is so awesome. And I really mean it. I hope that you find this book intellectually and spiritually stimulating, as well as emotionally engaging and at times even entertaining. And of course, I pray that like Will, this journey will guide you into a deeper, richer, and more abundant way of living this life. I am honored to be journeying with you. Peace and love.
Thank you for listening to Outside the Walls podcast. You can reach Brandon with thoughts and comments on Twitter at Brandon Andress or his website, brandonandress.com. We would love your 5-star ratings and reviews on iTunes, and please share this with a friend.